The coffee pot slipped from Keisha's grip, and for one suspended heartbeat, she watched it tumble toward the cracked linoleum floor. It shattered on impact, sending a spray of day-old coffee across her worn sneakers, but she barely felt the heat. Her eyes were locked on the man who had just walked through the diner door, bringing with him the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and a past she had spent 6 years burying. The clock above the register read 2:14 a.m. 2 hours until her shift ended. 2 hours until she could grab Zuri from the back booth and disappear into their tiny apartment 3 blocks away, where the locks were strong and the windows faced a fire escape she had memorized in the dark. The rent was paid barely. The electricity stayed on most months. At 29, Keisha Monroe had mastered the art of invisible survival. Working double shifts at the Crossroads Diner, where the neon sign flickered like a dying pulse. Serving truckers and insomniacs who never asked questions. Collecting cash tips that she split between rent, groceries, and the emergency fund hidden in a coffee can under the sink labeled flour. This was what freedom looked like. Not luxury, not security, but the razor-thin space between poverty and the alternative. And the alternative was the life she had fled, the world of obsidian and blood that this man represented. But Keisha had survived worse. So much worse. She reminded herself of that every single day. She had walked away from an empire built on fear. Compared to that, a graveyard shift waitress job was paradise. Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, fingers brushing the small velvet pouch she kept there always. Inside was the obsidian ring, its black stone carved with a crest she had once thought meant protection. The ring Julian Blackwood had given her 7 years ago when he still believed love could coexist with violence. When she still believed a man who commanded an underworld could somehow keep the darkness from touching her. Mama. Zuri's voice cut through the fog of memory. 6 years old with honey-brown skin and eyes the color of aged bourbon, exactly like her father's. Mama, you dropped the pot. Julian Blackwood. The name echoed in Keisha's mind like a prayer and a curse tangled together. From the moment she met him, Keisha had known he was dangerous. Not in the way men at the shelter where she volunteered were dangerous, all explosive rage and fists. Julian's danger was quiet, precise. A man who wore expensive suits over tattooed stories of violence. Who spoke in measured tones that made grown men flinch. Whose enemies simply vanished, reduced to whispered warnings and cold case files. He had found her on a Tuesday of all days. She had been volunteering at a community center in the South Side, teaching women self-defense, when a black car pulled up and Julian Blackwood himself stepped out. Not for trouble. Not for territory. His younger sister had just escaped an abusive relationship, and someone told him Keisha Monroe was the person who could help her heal. For 6 months, they circled each other. He brought his sister to sessions. Donated to the center with anonymous checks that kept the lights on. Watched Keisha with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel seen for the first time in her life. And then one night, after a session ran late, he had waited in the parking lot and simply said, "Have coffee with me. Just coffee. You can say no, and I'll never ask again." She should have said no. But Keisha had been alone for so long. Raised in the foster system, aged out at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a bone-deep knowledge of how to survive. She had built her life on helping others because no one had been there to help her. And here was Julian Blackwood, the most feared man in the city, looking at her like she was something sacred. The coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into late-night conversations where he told her about the war that killed his father and left him, at 19, responsible for an empire he never wanted. Where she told him about the group homes and the caseworkers who looked through her like she was already broken. They were two people shaped by violence, trying to find gentleness in each other. For one perfect year, Keisha believed it was possible. Julian kept his world separate from hers. He never brought the syndicate business to her door. Never let his lieutenants know her name. He gave her the obsidian ring on a rooftop garden in the middle of winter, snowflakes catching in her hair, and told her it was a promise. That the Blackwood crest meant protection. That she would always be safe. "I know what I am," he had said, his tattooed hands gentle on her face. "I know the things I've done. But with you, Keisha, I want to be different. I want to build something that isn't soaked in blood." 3 months later, she found out she was pregnant. And 1 week after that, she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. Julian's most trusted lieutenant, Marcus, arguing with him in the penthouse study. "She's a liability, Julian. The other families know about her now. They'll use her to get to you. And if there's a kid, you might as well paint a target on all of them. You want to protect her? You let her go. You make her disappear. Or someone else will make her disappear permanently." Keisha had pressed herself against the hallway wall, one hand on her still flat stomach, and listened to the long silence that followed, waiting for Julian to defend her, to say that nothing and no one would touch his family. Instead, she heard him say, "I'll handle it." Those 3 words broke something in Keisha that had never fully healed. She didn't wait to find out what "handle it" meant. That same night, she packed a single bag, left the ring on his pillow with a note that said only "I'm sorry," and vanished into the kind of anonymity that only the desperate can achieve. She became a ghost. Cut her hair. Changed her name on every document that didn't require a legal ID. Moved to the South Side's most forgotten neighborhood where she paid rent in cash and no one asked questions. Worked jobs that didn't require background checks. And when Zuri was born, Keisha held her daughter for the first time in a free clinic and made a vow: this child would never know the weight of the Blackwood name. Never sleep in a house where armed men stood guard. Never learn that her father was a king of a kingdom built on fear. For 6 years, Keisha kept that promise. Until tonight. Until Julian Blackwood walked into the Crossroads diner at 2:14 a.m., looking like a man who had aged a decade in 6 years. The tattoos on his neck were more elaborate now, creeping up toward his jawline. His suit was immaculate, charcoal gray with a black shirt underneath. But it was his eyes that stopped Keisha's breath. Those bourbon-colored eyes that she saw every single day in her daughter's face, now hollow with a grief that looked permanent. He sat at the counter, directly in front of the register, and for one desperate moment, Keisha thought maybe he wouldn't recognize her. Maybe the dyed hair and the weight she had lost and the 6 years of exhaustion written into her face would be enough of a disguise. But then Zuri, sweet and fearless and completely unaware of the danger, hopped down from her coloring book in the back booth and walked right up to the counter. "Mama, can I have apple juice?" she asked, her small hand reaching up to tug on Keisha's apron. Julian's head turned slowly, like a predator catching an unexpected scent. His eyes moved from Zuri to Keisha, and she watched recognition hit him like a bullet. His entire body went rigid. The coffee cup in his hand started to tremble. And then Zuri, because 6-year-olds notice everything and fear nothing, pointed at Julian's hand. "Sir," she chirped, her voice bright with innocent curiosity, "my mommy has a ring like that. She keeps it in a special bag. She says it's from someone who is brave, but also very sad." Keisha's heart stopped. On Julian Blackwood's right hand, the obsidian ring with the Blackwood crest caught the fluorescent light, throwing shadows across the counter. The exact twin of the ring hidden in Keisha's pocket. Julian's eyes moved to Zuri's face, really looking at her for the first time. The bourbon eyes. The shape of her nose. The way she tilted her head, curious and unafraid, exactly the way Julian's sister used to when she was young. The coffee cup slipped from Julian's hand, hitting the counter but not breaking, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Keisha." Not a question. A recognition. A name he had probably said 1,000 times in the dark, searching for a ghost. And Keisha knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 6 years building walls, that every single one of them had just come crashing down. The walls are down and the danger is just beginning. To find out if Keisha can protect her daughter from the man she once loved, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss a single second of how this confrontation unfolds. Julian Blackwood had killed 7 men in his lifetime. 3 with his own hands, 4 by order. He had walked into rooms knowing he might not walk out. Had stared down the barrels of guns held by people who hated him enough to die just to take him with them. Had buried his father, his uncle, and 2 of his oldest friends before he turned 30. But nothing had prepared him for this. The child standing in front of him had his eyes. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. The same amber bourbon color that he saw in the mirror every morning, that his father had, that every Blackwood for 3 generations had carried like a brand. And the little girl was looking at him with the fearless curiosity that his sister used to have, back before the family business taught her to see threats in every shadow. Julian's hands were shaking. He gripped the counter edge to steady them, his knuckles going white. The obsidian ring felt like it was burning his finger. 6 years. He had spent 6 years turning the city inside out looking for Keisha Monroe. Had paid investigators. Had called in favors from people who owed him blood debts. Had personally reviewed security footage from every bus station, train depot, and airport within 200 miles. Nothing. She had vanished so completely that Julian started to believe his enemies had gotten to her first. That somewhere in an unmarked grave lay the woman who had made him think redemption was possible. He had mourned her. Truly mourned her. Stopped attending syndicate meetings for months. Let Marcus run operations while Julian sat in his penthouse and tried to figure out how to keep breathing when the only good thing in his life had disappeared like smoke. And now she was standing 3 feet away, wearing a stained waitress uniform and looking at him like he was a loaded gun pointed at everything she loved. Because of course she was afraid. Of course she had run. Julian knew exactly what conversation she must have overheard that night. He had replayed it 1,000 times, hearing his own voice say, "I'll handle it," and understanding, too late, how those words must have sounded to Keisha. Like a death sentence. Like he was choosing the syndicate over her. "I'll handle it" had meant he was going to dismantle the organization. Retire the lieutenants who posed a threat. Walk away from the empire his father built and become the kind of man who could raise a family without armed guards and escape routes. He had started the process the very next morning, only to find Keisha's note and the ring on his pillow and realize he was too late. He had been planning their future. She had been planning her funeral. And now, sitting in a graveyard shift diner with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Julian Blackwood realized he had a daughter. A living, breathing child who thought he was just some stranger with a nice ring. His heir. His ghost. His second chance walking toward him in light-up sneakers. Julian is looking at a future he never thought he'd have. I want to hear from you. Do you think a man like Julian can ever truly change his nature? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from as we see what Keisha does next. Keisha moved on autopilot, steering Zuri back to the booth with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She grabbed the coloring book, the juice box, whispered something about finishing her picture of the cat. Then she walked back to the counter where Julian sat frozen, and the words came out flat and final. Not here. Not in front of her. Julian nodded once. His voice, when it came, was rough as gravel. When does your shift end? 4. But you need to leave. You need to. I've been looking for you for 6 years, Keisha. Each word landed like a stone. I'm not leaving. So she poured him coffee she knew he wouldn't drink and waited for the night to crawl toward dawn. At 3:45, the last trucker paid his bill and left. Keisha flipped the sign to closed, locked the door, and stood with her back against it like it could protect her from what was coming. I heard you, she said, before Julian could speak. That night, Marcus told you I was a liability. That the baby made me a target. And you said you'd handle it. Julian's jaw clenched. I was going to dismantle everything. Walk away from the syndicate. I started transferring assets the next morning, reassigning territories, paying out retirement packages to anyone who, he stopped, shook his head. You were already gone. I couldn't risk it. Keisha's voice cracked despite herself. I couldn't risk that. Handle it meant what I thought it meant. So I disappeared. She told him about the first 6 months living in a women's shelter, 8 months pregnant, and working under the table at a laundromat. About giving birth in a free clinic where they didn't ask for insurance or identification. About the night she held Zuri for the first time and made the choice that had defined every day since. Her daughter would grow up poor but safe, anonymous but alive. I've worked at 5 different diners, Keisha said. Moved apartments 7 times. Changed my hair 4 times. I pay rent in cash. I don't have social media. I don't have friends who ask questions. We exist in the margins, Julian. That's the only way I knew how to keep her away from your world. Julian was staring at Zuri, who had fallen asleep in the booth, her cheek pressed against a half-finished drawing of a purple cat. His hands were shaking again. She has my eyes, he said, and it sounded like a prayer and an apology tangled together. She has your sister's laugh, Keisha replied. Your father's stubborn chin. She stopped, pressed her palm against her mouth. She's everything good about you and nothing dark. I made sure of it. Julian stood slowly, like a man approaching something sacred. He walked to the booth but didn't touch Zuri. Just stood there, looking at his daughter for the first time, and Keisha watched the most feared man in the city break apart. 7 years ago, the rooftop garden had been Julian's one concession to beauty in a life built on brutality. He had brought Keisha there on a January night when the city below glittered with ice, and the sky was so clear you could see stars, despite the light pollution. She had worn his coat over her dress because she refused to let the cold drive them inside, and Julian remembered thinking that this woman, who worked with abuse survivors and believed people could change, was either the bravest or most foolish person he had ever met. There's going to be a war, he had told her, because he refused to lie to Keisha even when the truth tasted like ashes. The Rossetti family is pushing into our territory. My father's old allies are choosing sides. It's going to get bloody, Keisha. Worse than anything I've dealt with before. She had looked at him with those steady dark eyes that saw through every wall he had ever built. Are you telling me to leave? I'm telling you that staying with me means danger. Real danger. Not the kind I can protect you from with money or muscle. The kind that comes in the middle of the night when I'm on the other side of the city. Keisha had taken his tattooed hands in hers, tracing the ink that spelled out his father's death date across his knuckles. I've been in danger my whole life, Julian. Foster homes where nobody checked if the kids were safe. Streets where I learned to carry keys between my fingers. I know what real danger looks like. And I'm choosing to stay anyway. That was when he had pulled the ring from his pocket. Obsidian carved with the blackwood crest, set in white gold that caught the starlight. His father had worn one. His grandfather before that. It was the mark of protection, of family, of belonging to something bigger than yourself. In my world, Julian had said, sliding it onto her finger, this ring means you're untouchable. Every syndicate family will know what it represents. It's a talisman, Keisha. A shield. She had laughed, soft and sad. Or a target. Not while I'm breathing. He had pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. The war is coming, and I can't promise I'll make it out. But I can promise that anyone who touches you will answer to every remaining Blackwood. This ring is my vow, Keisha. You're mine to protect now. Always. She had kissed him then, tasting like hope and winter, and whispered against his mouth, then protect yourself too. Come home to me. 3 months later, the war ended with the Rossettis destroyed and Julian's reputation cemented as the most ruthless syndicate boss in a generation. And 2 weeks after that, Keisha had overheard Marcus's warning and disappeared with Julian's ring and his unborn child, believing the talisman had become exactly what she feared, a target painted on her back in obsidian and gold. Julian's phone buzzed at 4:23 a.m., shattering the fragile quiet of the diner. He glanced at the screen and his entire body went rigid. Marcus. Calling at this hour meant one thing: someone had been watching. Talk, Julian said, his voice dropping into the cold register that made men twice his size nervous. Marcus's voice came through tight and controlled. The Volkov crew spotted your car outside the Crossroads diner 2 hours ago. They ran the plates, put eyes on the location. Julian, they know you're not there for the coffee. Do you have a situation? Keisha had gone pale, reading Julian's body language like a survival manual. She moved to the booth where Zuri still slept, positioning herself between her daughter and the door. How many know? Julian asked. Hard to say. Volkov's second in command, definitely. Could be contained, could be spreading. You know how it goes. Information is currency, and a Blackwood with a secret is worth more than gold. Julian ended the call and turned to Keisha. We need to move. Now. No. Keisha's voice was steel-wrapped in terror. I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm not putting her in your world. They already know, Keisha. The Volkovs saw me here. By sunrise, every family with a grudge against me will know I have a weakness. They'll come looking. He stood, buttoning his jacket with mechanical precision. You have 2 choices. Come with me to a legitimate safe house, fully legal, no syndicate presence. Or stay here and wait for men who won't hesitate to use a 6-year-old as leverage. Keisha's hands were shaking as she reached for Zuri, gently waking her. Baby, we need to go on a little trip. Zuri rubbed her eyes, confused. Is it morning? Almost, sweetheart. Julian made 3 calls while Keisha gathered their things. The first to a real estate lawyer, he kept on retainer for legitimate business. The second to a private security firm, the kind that protected corporate executives and diplomatic families. The third to his driver, with instructions to bring the most unremarkable vehicle in his fleet. The safe house is in my sister's name, Julian told Keisha as they waited by the back door. A brownstone in the Garden District. No guards with visible weapons. No syndicate foot traffic. Security cameras, reinforced doors, panic rooms on every floor. But from the outside, it looks like any other family home. Your sister, Keisha said slowly. Does she know about? She's the only one who's known I've been looking for you. She'll help. The black sedan pulled into the alley, and Julian saw Keisha's entire body tense. He stepped closer, his voice low. I'm not the same man you ran from, Keisha. But you need to trust me for the next 72 hours. Just 72 hours, and I'll have eliminated the threat. Keisha looked at Zuri, then at Julian, and he saw the exact moment she realized she had no choice. The vultures were already circling. The brownstone's living room had tall windows that filtered morning light through sheer curtains, making everything soft and golden. Zuri sat on the floor with a box of crayons Julian's sister had provided, drawing another cat, this one orange with improbable purple spots. Julian sat on the couch nearby, pretending to read security reports on his tablet while actually watching his daughter exist in the world. Keisha had finally fallen asleep upstairs after 48 hours of exhausted vigilance. The security team was outside, invisible but present. And for the first time since walking into the Crossroads diner, Julian could breathe. Can I ask you something? Zuri's voice was small but curious, the way children's voices get when they're testing boundaries with strangers. Julian set down the tablet. Of course. She abandoned her drawing and walked over, stopping just close enough to be polite, but far enough to bolt if needed. Smart kid. Why do you have all those drawings on your skin? Julian looked down at his hands, the ink that climbed from his knuckles to disappear under his shirt sleeves. Each tattoo told a story he suddenly didn't want his daughter to know. His father's death date. The coordinates where he buried his first real enemy. The Latin phrase his grandfather had tattooed across his ribs, sanguis pro sanguinem. Blood for blood. They're called tattoos, he said carefully. I got them when I was younger. Do they hurt? When you get them, yes. After that, you forget. Zuri tilted her head, studying the intricate designs with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old. Mama says tattoos are stories on people's bodies. What stories do yours tell? Julian felt something crack open in his chest. How did he explain to this innocent child that his skin was a chronicle of violence? That the rose on his forearm represented his father's funeral? That the crow on his neck symbolized the 3 months he spent hunting the men who pulled the trigger? They tell stories about my family, he said finally. About people I loved who aren't here anymore. Like my grandpa? Yes, like your grandpa. Zuri reached out tentatively, her small finger tracing the date on his knuckle. Mama keeps a picture of someone in a box under her bed. She cries when she looks at it sometimes. Is that you? Julian couldn't speak. He just nodded. Are you going to make her cry again? The question landed like a blade between his ribs. Julian looked at this child, his child, with her light-up sneakers and crayon-stained fingers, and saw his entire future balanced on a knife's edge. She would grow up in a world where people asked about her father, where she'd want him at school events, birthday parties, normal moments in daylight. And he would be the man with murder tattooed on his hands. No, Julian said, his voice rough. I'm going to try very hard not to. Zuri studied him for another long moment, then nodded like she'd made a decision. Okay, do you want to color with me? Julian slid off the couch onto the floor beside his daughter, picked up a green crayon, and understood with perfect clarity that he couldn't hold her hand in public with blood still on his ledger. The ink on his skin was permanent, but the life it represented didn't have to be. The conference room in Julian's downtown office building looked legitimate enough. Glass walls, leather chairs, a view of the harbor that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. But the 10 men sitting around the table were anything but legitimate, and they knew exactly why Julian had called this meeting. You're out of your mind, Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. You're going to dismantle everything your father built. Everything we've protected for 3 decades. For what? A woman who ran from you and a kid you just met. Julian's hands were flat on the table, the obsidian ring catching the light. I'm divesting all illegal operations. The protection rackets, the gambling houses, the offshore accounts tied to laundering. I'm selling them to the Kozlov family at fair market value. They've already agreed to terms. The Kozlovs? Someone laughed, bitter and sharp. They'll carve up our territory in 6 months. They'll come after everyone who ever worked for you. No, they won't. Because I'm negotiating immunity for every man in this room. Clean slates. Severance packages. Legitimate business opportunities for anyone who wants them. Julian's voice was calm, surgical. The syndicate dies, but you don't have to. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against polished wood. And if we refuse? If we want to keep what's ours? Then you're choosing to be my enemy. Julian stood too, and the temperature in the room dropped. I've already transferred the real estate holdings. Liquidated the Swiss accounts. Handed over the shipping manifests and supplier contacts. The infrastructure is gone, Marcus. The only question is whether you walk away rich and alive, or whether you fight a war you've already lost. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, accusations flying like bullets. Traitor. Coward. Pussy-whipped. Julian let them rage, watching each man reveal exactly who he was when power slipped through his fingers. 3 stood with Marcus, faces hard with betrayal. 5 stayed seated, calculating odds. 2, the youngest of his father's old guard, nodded slowly like they'd been waiting for this moment. I have a daughter, Julian said, and the room went silent. She's 6 years old. She likes to color pictures of cats, and she asked me what my tattoos mean. And I realized I can't tell her the truth. I can't bring her to a world where armed men stand outside her school. Where every birthday party needs a security sweep. Where she grows up knowing her father's name makes people afraid. So you're just going to abandon everything, Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt. Walk away like it means nothing. It means everything. That's why I'm burning it down. Julian pulled a folder from his briefcase, slid it across the table. These are the severance terms. You have 72 hours to accept or reject. After that, anyone still operating Blackwood business becomes a liability I will eliminate. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then grabbed the folder and walked out. 3 men followed. The remaining 6 stayed, and Julian saw the exact moment they understood. The king had abdicated, and the throne was being demolished brick by brick to build something his daughter could inherit without blood on the foundation. The building had once been a textile factory, all exposed brick and industrial windows that let in floods of natural light. Julian had bought it through a legitimate LLC, renovated it with union labor, and filled it with resources that read like Keisha's wish list from a decade ago: legal aid offices, counseling rooms with soft furniture and boxes of tissues, a children's playroom painted in colors that didn't remind anyone of institutional walls, a commercial kitchen for teaching job skills, and 24 secure residential units for families who needed to disappear. The sign above the entrance read the Monroe Foundation in brushed steel letters. Keisha's name. Zuri's name. The legacy Julian was determined to build from the ashes of the one he'd burned down. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable except for the 50 people gathered in the main hall. Journalists from legitimate outlets. City council members. Domestic violence advocates who had worked with Keisha years ago and remembered her name. And standing in the back, deliberately invisible, 2 of Julian's former men who had taken the severance and asked if there was any other way they could help. Keisha stood at the podium in a dress Julian's sister had helped her pick out, looking every bit the woman who had spent years working with survivors. Zuri sat in the front row, her legs swinging, wearing a purple dress that matched her favorite imaginary cat. "This foundation exists because I know what it's like to run," Keisha said, her voice steady despite the tremor Julian could see in her hands. "I know what it's like to choose between safety and everything else. To live in the margins because the alternative is dying in the light. The Monroe Foundation is for every person who has ever had to make that choice. We offer legal protection, housing, job training, and a promise: you don't have to be afraid anymore." Julian watched from the side of the room, his hands in his pockets, the obsidian ring heavy on his finger. 6 months ago, that ring had represented power through fear. Now it represented something harder to build and easier to lose: protection through love. When Keisha finished speaking, she stepped down from the podium and reached for Zuri's hand. The little girl looked up at her mother, then across the room at Julian, and made a decision that stopped his heart. She pulled her hand free from Keisha's and walked across the polished floor, her light-up sneakers flashing with each step, until she stood directly in front of Julian. "Mama says you helped build this place," Zuri said, looking up at him with those Blackwood eyes that would never have to see the things his had seen. "I did," Julian managed. "Can I tell people you're my dad?" Julian knelt down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter, and felt tears he hadn't cried since his father's funeral burn behind his eyes. "I would be honored if you did." Zuri smiled, then reached for his hand. And Julian Blackwood, who had once ruled an empire through violence, walked out into the sunlight holding his daughter's small hand in his scarred one. Finally understanding that the most powerful thing a boss could ever do was create a place where no one had to be afraid. Julian burned his world to the ground to save his daughters, proving that true power isn't about what you control, but what you protect. If you love stories where the broken find a way to win, make sure you're subscribed so you're here for our next journey.